Welcome to Mysterious Universe, Season 24, Episode 2. Coming up on the show, we've got the daycare center at the end of the world, the mysterious men in tan, and the quantum fluctuations of the Randonauts. I'm Benjamin Grundy, joining me is Aaron Wright.
I'm surprised that I found that story. It was right at the end of the day when the story portal opened, and I came across this incredible story of a woman that claims that she encountered something quite disturbing at, of all places, a daycare centre on the outskirts of the New South Wales coast.
I thought you were talking about the men in tan.
Oh, no,
She
the men
just
in tan
encountered a man wearing tan. He was very intimidating.
No, the men in tan follow the same kind of practices as the men in black, except where the men in black kind of threaten your life and tell you shouldn't talk about it because I'm going to erase your family. The men in tan just bore you to death to the point where you go, oh, fine, I won't talk about my UFO sighting.
It's an example of a man in tan. When you say man in tan, I think of Steve Irwin. He used to wear the tan shorts and tan top.
No.
That's tan, right?
No, yeah, tan. Yeah, tan is kind of like a brownie kind of... The men in brown.
Okay.
The men, it's a kind of like a browny yellow, but that shouldn't really matter. I mean, we're sounding like Bill Chalker now, but it's like this one is brown.
Yeah, like when we saw that Australian UFO researcher who described the colour of his books for a good 20 minutes before he started his talk.
But for the show, we've got something far more exciting coming up for you. I'm going to go into UFOs now and then, UFOs in present times and the past. It's by Moira McGee. And you know, Ben, I believe that psychometry exists because the moment that I picked up this book, I had these images flashing in my head of a cheesecake with a cigarette stuffed out in it.
That's right, honey. Moira, of course, we met at a UFO, not a UFO conference, but a presentation.
Stephen Strong's presentation.
Stephen and Evan Strong. She was sitting next to Aaron eating a cheesecake, and she was about 3 gin and tonics into the presentation.
I just loved her. I thought she was fantastic. But as a researcher, I think she's a really good researcher. And one thing about her is that she does cover some stories that do defy the limits of believability, but she actually expresses that and she says, look, I can't validate this story. This is just a story that's been told to me, because people come to her in Australia. She's a leading researcher in Australia, and people come to her with sometimes really outrageous stories. And that's what a lot of this book is. It's not necessarily just focusing on Australia, though. She is covering global cases from other researchers that she's worked with and done, communications with. But essentially, what's really good about this book, it was only released last year, is that I think Moira gets it. She really highlights the fact that as much as the UFO phenomenon appears to be a nuts and bolts phenomenon, and I really like that idea. I think, the idea that it's just another species coming from another planet that have developed technology more advanced than us, yeah, that's logical. But she does really highlight this kind of underlying, simmering kind of, I guess, concept.
Just say high strangeness.
It's not just high strangeness. It's also that the entities that are responsible for the UFO phenomenon deeply understand the human psyche. They know how to manipulate it, and they're doing it for purposes that may not necessarily be good. So I'm going to go into a lot of those sorts of stories on the show, but what have you got coming up towards the end, Ben?
Well, a ton of people recently, and a shout out to everyone who's sent this my way, I was looking at the Randonautica app.
What is that?
Have you heard of this Randonauts?
No.
It's a recent thing. It's really big on TikTok. So it's the world's first quantumly generated choose-your-own-adventure reality game. But basically it's magic. I figured it's just magic. It's millennials doing magic.
What do you mean magic?
So it's an app you get on your phone, and essentially what you're trying to do is focus your intentions before you press a particular button on the app, right? And your intentions might be like a feeling or an object or something that you want to happen to you. Like you might think happiness. Recently, one of the users was focusing on death. And
that can't end well.
I'll share what happened. But essentially what it's doing is the app is connecting to several databases. One of them is one of the ANU's.
The Australian National University.
Yeah, it's one of the ANU's quantum generated random number generators.
Oh, yeah, okay.
It's not like a typical algorithm. It's some kind of quantum program that's generating it. You can also connect to the Global Consciousness Project and get data from there. And the idea is that your intention is somehow manipulating the random number generator. Your intention is changing something. And so the data you get back is essentially an anomaly in your immediate area. It looks at your location and it gives you a specific set of coordinates to visit on the map.
So what, it's like psychic Pokemon or something?
Kind of. Yeah, and people have been having all sorts of strange results from going to these coordinates and following the clues. So, for example, someone on Reddit, there's a subreddit called Randonautica, they said their intention was to see something unexplainable. And this is just a really average kind of result that they got. And the set of coordinates was in the middle of a field somewhere, like a 5-minute drive from their house, middle of nowhere, this field. And so they go out into the middle of this field and they, get their phone out and follow the walking directions, and they get to the middle of this field and there's nothing in the middle of the field except for where the pin dropped on the map, sent from a quantum random number generator. There's a couch. There's just a random couch.
High strangeness.
There's a random couch in the middle of this field. And that's the answer to their intention of seeing something unexplainable.
Interesting. Okay, well, I'm looking forward to unpacking that later. I don't really understand what the point of it is, apart from maybe it's entertainment, but I guess you'll explain that.
It's really just to experience synchronicities and see where they go and what the meaning is behind them.
I wonder if there's a danger, though, in forcing synchronicities.
There's definitely dangers.
Right, yeah.
Especially when these people that are into the spooky side of things focus all their intention on the concept of death or the idea of death. And then the app leads them somewhere that is very associated with that concept.
All right, well, that's coming up. Well, you know what? It's funny that you should mention synchronicities, because that kind of stuff is what we were talking about recently on the Plus show this week, about premonitions and synchronicities and the roles that they play in people's lives and how they guide you. One thing I was also picking up when I was doing some research for that book is that we were talking about the concept of non-local consciousness and how your brain doesn't actually generate consciousness. It's just simply a filter. It's a receiver for consciousness. And this is something that I think, unbeknowingly, Moira has actually picked up in a number of her cases where people have had interactions with extraterrestrials, and in having those interactions with the extraterrestrials, it's changed their psyche in some way, that all of a sudden they've developed psychic abilities, telekinesis. And this is why in some cases when you hear of things like people seeing a UFO, and then in the following week when they've gone home, that they've had poltergeist-like activity in their home, it's not actually because an entity has been attached to them or something has followed them home, although it might be. But it also could be possible that the interaction in itself has changed something in the psyche of the witness, which has caused telekinetic type of activities to take place. It's actually being generated by the witness as opposed to something that's going on the outside. And I picked that up in a story that came from South Africa, of all places, and it came from the research of Cynthia Hind. And you may recall she wrote that great book, African Encounters.
Yeah.
And, she describes this experience that she had, a contactee who had a weird encounter contacted her and said, look, I've read your book and this is something that happened to me. His name was Peter. And he claims in 1974 that he was making this late night drive in Rhodesia to Durban. And he said he very quickly realized that their vehicle was being followed by something. It was this light in the distance. And the light came closer and closer and closer. And at first, believing that it was a UFO, believing that it was something conventional like a helicopter, he rapidly realized that this was a UFO. And the moment that it clicked in his head that it was a UFO, he said the UFO took control of the car. He said the car was self-driving as this light was pouring in through the windows. Now, he said the car sped up. And as the car sped up, he tried to put his foot on the gas, and he said he finally regained control of the car. And he stopped, and he found that it was about 4:30 in the morning, which is always, the opportune time for these things to come along. But he said he resumed his journey, and he said he was not far from the city when this circular object reappeared and rejoined them. It started pursuing them again. The vehicle was again engulfed in this light beam that took control of the car. And he said this time, the wheels of the car actually lifted off the road. And he said the speed was increasing. He said he could see the odometer going faster and faster and faster and faster, but the car actually wasn't. He couldn't feel the speed of the car increasing. But he said as he was looking around, trying to work out what the situation was, he said while he knew he was driving through desert terrain, he said all he could see around him was this lush green wetland. And from Cynthia's research, she believes that this is some type of holographic element that comes up in a number of experiences that people have on deserted roads. The UFO will lift them up and will project a different image around them. And I don't know why it would do that.
Yeah, why wouldn't you use the same image of where they're driving?
The suggestion is here that it's also playing some type of role in priming the brain for some type of change. And this is where these psychic kind of things come in. And it could be something as simple as just getting the mind into a more potentially hypnotic state. Or maybe even you've heard stories about just simply looking at greenery and looking at forest calms people down. It might have this role that it plays. Again, as I was pointing out, the understanding of psychology.
Going to need more than a tree to calm me down when my car's being sucked up by a UFO.
The thing is, it's all part of the process, right? You're absolutely right. But there could be other factors that we simply don't understand that are taking place here. But he says the other thing he noticed is that as he was watching, he said the sound of locusts, which was really loud previously, had completely stopped. It was like someone had just switched it off, which is something we commonly hear as the Oz effect, which was identified by Jenny Randles, among other researchers. But he said that it came to around 7 a.m. and he was approaching the South African border and the craft disappeared and he was able to resume driving. Everything kind of returned to normal and the light was coming back up. But he realized that he had actually arrived an hour early. So he'd been somehow propelled forward. It wasn't like there was missing time. It had been pushed forward. But he said the gas was proportionately less than what he'd expected as well, obviously because the car had been lifted off the ground. But he said the car started developing some strange electrical problems and eventually the car actually had to be repaired. But he got home. And this is the odd thing. Immediately after having this experience, as traumatizing as it was, he didn't realize it was traumatizing. But he knew that there was something wrong and he started having these sudden prophetic dreams. He would be able to have a dream about what his next day would be and who he'd interact with and what would happen, from things that were very banal to a cup dropping or smashing on the ground, to seeing a car accident before him. He was having these premonitions that only seemed to come about after the interaction with these beings. But he doesn't know what the beings are. He couldn't recall. Now, Cynthia points out that many people that experience close encounters in themselves seem to fit into this category of developing these psychic abilities, particularly precognition. But for the purpose of it, we really can't understand. But one thing that really sticks out is that Peter seemed to be able to recall a memory of a mental communication he had with one of the entities that was operating the UFO. He can't describe what the being looked like, but he said he knew that as they were driving along or as they were being pushed along by this UFO, the being was telling him details about psychic phenomena. And one thing the being told Peter was that he would be able to project an image, an appropriate representation of himself anywhere he wanted. And we forgot about this for a while until later on when he was again driving down the road. There was no UFO anywhere nearby. He said all of a sudden, as he was driving, a humanoid male suddenly appeared in the back seat of his car.
What?
He turns around and it's him. It's a projection from his mind. He essentially had been given the ability to project tulpas, self-tulpas.
But he must have had an intention to do that, right? But you're saying it just appeared randomly.
Well, the intention must have been that he was thinking about the communication. So he was told that he was capable of projecting some type of image of himself, and he was able to do this. And somehow, while thinking about it, it appeared in the vehicle behind him. It remained there for some time during the journey.
Do? Hello.
But that's the thing. We don't know any detail. Apparently, he just kept on driving.
Great.
He was like, oh, okay, I've projected a tulpa into the back of the car, and then just continued to drive. Some really surreal and out there kind of experiences, but something that, very early in this book begins to demonstrate that the UFO phenomenon is anything but nuts and bolts. It's not, nuts and bolts may play a part, but in reality, there's something more psychic going on here. There's something more etheric, and potentially there's something more disturbing, because as I said, if ETs understand our psychology that well, just imagine how they can integrate into our world, how they can get in and essentially move amongst us without being detected. And that's exactly what happens in a couple of cases that are listed in the book later on. They seem to be some type of infiltration, but it's kind of a by accident style of infiltration. One comes from France. It actually was reported in 1901, but allegedly it started in September of 1900. And much like what seems to happen in a number of strange appearances of UFOs and extraterrestrials, there was this freak weather storm that came out of nowhere. It hit this local village in the south of France. A local farmer was awakened by this insistent tapping on the window downstairs in his bedroom. So he tries to ignore it at first because he thinks it's just something to do with the wind. But eventually he realizes that it's rhythmic and there might actually be someone behind it. So he grabs hold of a lantern and he goes down to the door. Now, when he goes down to the door, he says standing outside was a small boy. He was about 10 years old, but there was something that wasn't quite right about him. On top of the fact that apparently he was luminous. He was pale.
Something not quite right.
Not quite right.
Glowing.
He was glowing.
Radioactive.
His hair was long and yellow, completely unlike the local lads that all had dark hair. And his only clothing seemed to be a sack. It was a strange material kind of sack that was wrapped around his shivering body. So the farmer's wife came out and she took pity upon the child and they brought him inside. And he slept on the mattress in front of the fire that night, but there was something very odd about him. He didn't seem to understand how to wear clothes. She brought down a shirt for him. He didn't know what buttons were. He didn't know what food was. She put food in front of him and he was kind of like just pushing it around. Exactly. He didn't know what a knife and fork was. He didn't know what a cup was. He drank from the top of the cup and spilt it all down his front. He was even scared of the cat. He was absolutely terrified by it. Now, the farmer assumed that simply he was like just a moron, or he was a dumb waif is the term.
Village idiot.
The village idiot that was used. But initially he couldn't speak. But eventually he very rapidly seemingly learnt their language. And it was a language that he was able to pick up, that he started speaking his own language that they'd never heard before. On top of that, they took him to the local priest to try and explain, look, we've found this boy and he's acting very strange. So the priest started showing him pictures and drawings, trying to, just basically get some communication out of him. And very rapidly, he found that the child was extremely intelligent. He seemed to be able to do mathematical formulas.
What?
He was able to get this pen and paper and he was writing dots at high speed that ended up being some type of formula or some type of mathematical form.
How do you go from showing him pictures to see if he understands basic words to mathematical formulas?
Apparently, he could work out the square root of anything. He was working out cubic roots of things and groups of numbers. He was fascinated by physical movements as if he'd never seen them before. He would sit for hours just watching birds and rippling water and the clouds.
This is the plot to Good Will Hunting. They've just ripped it off.
No, the suggestion is that this boy, they don't know exactly, but the suggestion is this boy had somehow been dropped off by something, by a UFO. Apart from the fact he was luminous, the second thing is that his hands only had 3 fingers.
Right. Okay.
And it wasn't that he was deformed.
I like how all of this is really subtle. Like, there's something strange about this kid. I wonder what it is. Someone else comes along. Oh, he's glowing green and he's only got 3 fingers.
Exactly. But as we know in many of these sorts of stories is that, unfortunately, they can't remain in our atmosphere for an extended period of time. And after Christmas, the boy became very sick with what appeared to be a bad cold. It took him a few weeks to recover. But in February, his pallor became quite, light again. He developed a high fever. And the doctors came around to examine him. And when the doctors examined him, the doctor was completely disturbed because his heart rate was less than half of any normal human heart rate. But he didn't seem to have any heart condition or heart problem. He gradually became weaker and died in early March. They buried him under an ash tree in the local graveyard, and his grave has since been lost. It's just disappeared to time. But the suggestion is that this is some type of extraterrestrial that has unfortunately somehow been dropped off, or somehow it doesn't fit with other stories of strange children. This is something that's not right about
it is super weird.
The fact that he's luminous, okay?
He has 3 fingers, dude.
3 fingers. So let's not forget it. But what is funny is that throughout this book, Moira references her old works, and, I picked up those as well, which I will go through it in the future, but they didn't really fit with what I was doing today. But she's got, I think it's the Gosford Files, which is about strange UFO and ET interactions that people had in the 1960s, 70s, 80s on the central coast of New South Wales here in Australia. And she also has the Oz stories. I think it's the Oz Contacts. It's basically another, group of collections of stories of people that have had interactions with ETs across Australia. And, Woy Woy is one area of the Central Coast that she references where a very strange story came out of it. And while it's not a young boy, it does fit in with this idea of maybe extraterrestrials are coming to Earth. But like the ET story, essentially, the UFOs are leaving and they're leaving the beings behind, because there was a story of a young man in the 1980s who had gone fishing out in Woy Woy. And while he was fishing, apparently the dusk had come over and it was slowly getting darker. There was still a little bit of light. And he heard this terrible scream as they're sitting there. I guess I'm assuming. Yeah. Maybe not that bad. It was more animalistic and high-pitched,
okay.
but pretty close. And so he hears this scream, and they're all disturbed because these are seasoned, outdoorsmen. They know what the area is like. You know what birds you hear. We don't really have any large animals here that would, make that noise. And so they all jumped up, and as they jumped up, they saw this thing kind of moving in the bushes behind them. So one of these guys went running straight for it, as you do, and he went running straight for this thing, and he could see it, and he just saw this grey form kind of just like flitter through the trees and the foliage. So as it flitted through, it jumped down into this, basically where these boulders had been, and there was a ledge hanging over the top of the boulders, and there was water that was passing through. So there was this loud noise going through, and as he got closer, he could still hear the water moving. But as the water was moving, he could hear this like a terrified,
what the hell?
And it sounded like maybe a cat, or it sounded like something, but it wasn't. It was inhuman, and it wasn't like any typical animal, as I said. He looks over the ledge, and it literally, he claims, is a grey-type being about 4 foot tall, absolutely terrified of this guy. Just terrified.
Poor little thing.
Well, I mean, yeah.
Poor little guy.
I guess you could feel compassion, but, you know, if it's the Greys that abduct people from their bedrooms at night, maybe you wouldn't feel that compassion. But immediately, obviously, his reaction was that he screamed as well. The thing screamed. He ran off. He ran off and went and reported it, which finally ended up getting through the New South Wales, UFO groups, and the story got back to Moira. So allegedly the story is true. I mean, well, and the fact that the actual story, like the person who claims to have had this experience, is a genuine person. But yet another example of how sometimes, as much as ETs, we think that they're quite powerful and that, they've got a low control, they make mistakes. They let their beings, out of their craft, and who knows. One other suggestion that comes up in the Gosford files is that there is already, there's maybe some type of research that's going on in that area between the the Australian government and the US government. And they've been testing craft and whether or not those craft are extraterrestrial or based on extraterrestrial, reverse engineering. Maybe the extraterrestrials are keeping an eye on it and watching what's going on. The source
for this information, Rex Gilroy?
No, it's not actually. Although, funnily enough, you should mention that because she does reference actually in this book a story from Rex Gilroy. So I did gloss over that one. And the reason being is it was a little bit out there. But, I'll call it. She does point out that when she finds a story that is a little bit basically a boomer on Facebook believes everything, she will actually declare it as that. And she does reference a case from Michael Salla, of all people. And she says in 2008, she says, Salla posted this really fascinating article on his website. And I must stress that I cannot say whether this information is accurate or not, but I want to bring it to your attention. And she says that he wrote about Clark McClellan. Now, I'd never heard of Clark McClellan before, but apparently he was this retired NASA spacecraft operator. I don't know exactly what type of job that is, but for 34 years, he'd been involved in numerous NASA missions.
I think that's an astronaut.
No, I don't know.
Spacecraft operator. It sounds like an astronaut
to
me.
Maybe, but apparently he was involved in...
No, I'm not an astronaut. I'm a spacecraft operator. It's very different.
Yeah, astronaut is pejorative. It has to be, a spacecraft operator. Great. But he claims that he was involved
I looked it up. Clark McClellan.
Yeah.
Astronaut.
Oh, there you go. Right. Okay, well, there you go. Well, according to this astronaut from the claims of Michael Salla, McClellan made testimony that whilst he was on duty, he observed on his video monitor an alien spacecraft in a stabilizing orbit at the rear of the space shuttle's main engine pods. A 9-foot-tall ET was standing upright on the space shuttle's payload bay, having a discussion with two tethered US NASA astronauts. Okay, you've got 9 of them. McClellan also claimed that a colleague told him on another occasion that an 8 to 9 foot tall ET had come inside the space shuttle. So I'm like, oh, okay. So you can see where she's willing to... willing to entertain anything that's a little bit ridiculous. But no, look, let's go back to France, because France has this whole, wide history of strange encounters that people had. But one relates to something that came from the 12th of June in 1790, that far back. There was this large spherical globe that was surrounded by flame that was emitting this whistling sound that collided with something before dropping down onto a hill. Now, when it got down onto the hill, apparently it gave off so much heat that it set fire to the grass and the trees that were there. But a kind of door opened and someone dressed in a tight-fitting suit came out. The person came down, uttered some unintelligible words, and then ran into the woods. When it ran into the woods, the sphere exploded, setting fire to everything else around it.
Right.
And that was it. It's like, what are these ETs doing? I mean, they're coming, like, why? Why are they doing this? But I wanted to reference the French stories because this one stands out from some of the other cases that we've reported in the past, Ben. And do you recall the story I did, and I'm sure you'll remember it was only recently, of the Bigfoot that seemingly was grabbing hold of some type of glowing ball of light, and he was wrestling with it, and he managed to throw it, or it flew away from him. Stan Gordon from Pennsylvania, who's done all that research, has pointed out there's plenty of stories where Bigfoot seems to be associated with balls of light. It comes up in a French case from October of 1954 in Laveau. And this is a little bit different because it's not entirely, it doesn't appear at first to be a Bigfoot until you listen to the details. So apparently a man was on a bicycle and he found himself face to face with a weird being. He claims that as he was going for a ride, he came across this being that was about 1.3 meters in height. So it's not as tall as a Bigfoot, but it was wearing a suit that seemed to be some type of cloak. He said it was covered in a mass of hair. It was this thick, dark brown hair that was all over its entire body, and its eyes were shining through, much like what we hear in lots of these Bigfoot kinds of stories. Now, he said, not surprisingly, he was made fun of by people, but apparently the French national press went and interviewed him and asked him more details about his experience. And he said that he'd seen a silvery machine land in a local field, and nearby it was witnessed by other people. So it wasn't just him that had the experience, but these other witnesses described a similar kind of man. They said he was about 1.2, 1.3 meters tall that emerged from the machine. He was wearing a black sack, but much like what a priest would wear. But again, his face was extremely hairy and had these huge eyes. But in the abdominal region of his body was a glowing sphere that seemed to be rotating in the center of his body. The creature uttered a few words, like the story I told you before, that the men could not understand. Apparently, they were so frightened, they all made a hasty retreat. The being, not knowing what to do, just kind of looked around, climbed back into the machine, and then flew off into the night sky. So these parallels that come up with other stories, it's like it matches with the story of this unintelligible language that comes.
You just did a story like this on the last Plus show.
It's weird, isn't it?
Of the strange entities showing up and throwing a white electricity ball.
That's right.
At the eyewitness.
Yeah, it's really strange how you've got these parallels that are coming from, it's much further back. I mean, we're talking the 1950s here, so it wasn't in popular culture. I mean, you had a little bit of sci-fi popping up, but this kind of stuff is repeated case after case after case. And this is why, books like Moira's are really good, because you can start to draw the parallels in these cases and go, well, look, is this part of some type of weird collective unconscious thing that's in our psychology? Or is it that people genuinely are seeing these creatures and they're part of a similar species or they're part of a similar group because they're using similar technology? I don't know what to make of it. But let's continue with more of these strange cases that pop up. And, bicycles are something that apparently have their own subcategory of experiences. We hear so many stories of people being stalked by UFOs while they're driving their cars late at night. But apparently bicycle riders experience the same thing. And we hear the story of Shane. So this is from 1956, so an earlier case as well. And this happened in New Zealand. Shane had a part-time job at a bakery, and every morning before school, he would get up at around 2 a.m. and he would cycle to work. Now, he'd been doing this for a long time without incident until one morning when he was riding down the road, he came to this this bushy kind of darkened area where there are no street lamps. And as he got there, he was suddenly engulfed by a dense fog. The fog seemed to have an intelligence about it. It seemed to be that the fog wasn't just natural fog that occurs. He said the fog suddenly became so bright and luminescent that the headlight of his bike started bouncing off. It actually bounced off this light. It was like it was a wall of some kind. Now, he said, when this happened, the fog lifted and he found before him this bright cigar-shaped craft that had this fiery exhaust and it was climbing vertically up into the sky. But as it was taking off, it was almost like it had been caught out because the bottom of it was almost smacking into the mountain as it was trying to get thrust to move itself up into the sky. So it's like he may have caught this thing out. But he says 2 days later, I mean, he just says it was a weird experience, but he went to work. But 2 days later, when he was riding past a quarry, he said he noticed this bright stream of light that was streaming down the cliff face. Now, he stopped and tried to look closer, and he realized that what it was a round ball of light. He said it was about 60 centimeters in diameter, and it was scanning the cliff face with this beam of light. Now, he said as he was watching, the ball suddenly froze. Now, he turned off his noisy dynamo, he said. It was small, but it was noisy. And he waited there in anticipation, thinking, is this thing seen me? What's it going to do? And he says apparently the ball just suddenly resumes its activity, whatever it's doing, just pacing back and forward, scanning this thing. But he says the next thing he realizes is that he's kneeling at the bakery door, covered in blood, crying for help. His nose was pierced by something, his teeth were missing, his lip was torn away, and his boss thought he'd been hit by a car. He was taken to hospital, and people set about looking for his bicycle. Now, they thought this bicycle, shouldn't be too far away, but it arrived a lot later than his normal time.
He obviously has no memory of what happened.
He has no memory of what happened, but he had missing time. The strange thing is that he was less than a kilometre from his work. It wasn't far that he had to go. His bike was found 7 kilometres away in a creek, upside down, bent at a right angle in the frame. Now, there was no paint scratches on it. There was nothing that would indicate a collision with the car. It was almost like something of incredible power had just bent his bike in half. There was no lacerations on his knees or his legs. It was just his face. Now, Shane eventually says that he feels like it was 15 minutes that he was blacked out, but it ended up being a lot longer. But he apparently had an idea that something had taken him while he was riding on his bike. It had come after him. And he said, despite all the trauma that he had, like what I was saying about psychic abilities, he said in the following 37 years, he developed incredible psychic abilities that allowed him to protect himself from dangerous things in his life going forward.
Was he projecting tulpas?
Well, no, he wasn't projecting.
Did he get one of those tandem bikes and suddenly his double was just behind him?
You know what? That would be great because then you wouldn't have to ride. You just get your tulpa to do all the work for you. No, he didn't have that, but that sets up the scene for something that comes up a little bit later on that suggests that people, and we've touched on this before, Ben, and I want to go into this in more detail, of people that are abductees seem to have uncanny good luck when it comes to difficult situations like car accidents or, being in war, or for some reason, it's almost like the entities want to keep their prizes protected. They're more than happy to let their lab rats run around on Earth, but if something happens to them, they have to protect them. And this is where we come to this really crazy concept of the implant, the force field implant. And this is towards the back of the book. And I thought this was really fascinating because throughout this book, there's just so many examples of abductees that get themselves, as I said, into car accidents or get themselves into difficult situations and seemingly survive. And there's really extreme examples. So there's the story that comes from Dick. And Dick is an Australian who ended up having a UFO experience in Hawaii in 1956. Apparently, he was there on holidays. He was walking down a hill with 2 friends. He said in the distance, about 100 foot away from him, he says this silver disc-shaped kind of craft appears at a hilltop at a very low level. It moves slowly over the top of them. And as it moves over the top of them, it makes this kind of humming sound. And they can feel it through their body. And they felt like they were intimidated by this machine. So they start running down the hill and this craft pursues them. They all fall over. And when they fall over, they black out. They wake up, and when they wake up, they find that they've had missing time. The UFO is still there, but they said the UFO was now tilted at a 45-degree angle, and then it suddenly accelerated and disappeared. Now, Dick says that, again, 1956, but he says over the years, he and his 2 friends felt this strange compulsion never to talk about the incident with each other or anyone else. And he says this was like something that was inside him, something that had been implanted inside him. And this is like, again, the psyche of the ETs and their ability to understand our psychology. But he says finally, he came about and wanted to talk about his experiences after something that happened to him in the Vietnam War. So during the Vietnam War, he was a company commander. And he said he survived miraculously on multiple occasions. He said he'd been in situations where he was about to be killed, whether it was a knife, who was going to be shot, who was going to be blown up. He said the men around him were killed instantly, but somehow he survived through these flukes, through this luck. Now, that's possible. Like, let's say it's rare.
Yeah, sure.
But let's say it's possible that maybe he has managed to survive. You don't survive when you get a rocket fired into your face.
What?
So Dick claims that he has this memory.
Oh my God, he's dead.
Well, he's not. That's the thing. He's not dead. He claims that apparently the enemy popped up with a shoulder rocket-propelled grenade, points it directly in his face at point blank and fires it. Now, he says he was covered in shrapnel wounds, but nothing happened to him. He survived it. He said all of his comrades...
Wait, hang on. There was impact from the rocket?
Yeah. He said,
in his face?
In his face. It fired a rocket into his face, but wait for it, right? So it's like, where is this coming from? Like, this is crazy.
Is it real, fuckers? Is it real?
Look, allegedly it is, because it comes from a Dudley Robb, who was a INU4 investigator, and he got this from a Pacific UFO conference in Hawaii in 1996 when, during a coffee break, Dick came up to him and told him about this experience. But going back to how do you survive getting a rocket fight in your face?
How do you take a rocket launcher to the face?
Well, he reckons that apparently after he came to, he looked around and war's horrible. We know war's horrible, and everyone around him essentially had been blown apart by this rocket. So there's no way, even through a fluke, that he should have been able to survive this thing. But he went into the hospital because he had to have the shrapnel removed. It was a field hospital. The shrapnel was removed, but all the shrapnel was in his extremities. But apparently years later, he was having an X-ray because he had this kind of pain in the back of his head. And when they did the X-ray, they found that there was this strange metal object that had been inserted underneath the back of his ear towards the, the back, the cerebellum of his brain. And, the medical opinion was that, well, you've been in war, so this is probably shrapnel of some kind, and it's too close, and if we remove it, it might actually kill you, so we'll just leave it in place. But Dick said he realized quite quickly that this wasn't some piece of shrapnel, because it hadn't come from this. He believes that this was some type of implant. He believes that when he had his experience all the way back in 1956 and had missing time, that he'd been abducted, and while he was abducted, some implant was placed inside him. But the implant functioned not simply as a tracking device, that might be one of its utilities.
Force field.
It was also a force field, exactly. It had saved his life. He felt that this thing, connected with some type of higher power that was controlling it, had saved his life, had favored him because it didn't want to lose its lab rat. And that actually makes sense.
So obviously it's an automatic force field.
It's an automatic force field.
The rocket is a proximity detector. When any kind of rocket comes close to your face,
any kind
it just goes...
well, maybe not that last part.
The explosion.
Maybe. Yeah, well, we'll go with that. We'll say that sound, but yeah, we'll go close to that. The other thing is, Moira points out, she says, this isn't the first time that I've heard of this. They might have abilities to do other things that it doesn't even have to be a force field. She says that when she was at a conference once, she doesn't give the name of the person who said this, but he was a military man. He came up to her and said, look, I've had a really bizarre experience. And she said, well, please tell me. And he said, well, look, I was a sentry and I was manning a military base. And while I was manning this military base, out of nowhere, an alien approached me. He came from a landed craft that was just on the other side of the barrier. When this alien came towards me, I didn't know what it was, but I knew that I had to fire. So he said he started firing shot after shot at this advancing creature. Now, the soldier claims that he was amazed because he said every time he fired a shot, like the Matrix, the bullet started slowing down as they came out of the gun barrel. He said they would just drop to the ground 2 feet in front of this being. And he kept on firing this automatic weapon into this thing, and they would go flying through until they were about 2 feet away and would just drop. He said he immediately ran back to the main barracks, and he told other people, and the other people came. Other people came. Apparently, the alien just ran back towards the craft, and the craft flew away. But Moira suggests, is there some type of guardian angel that's working? No, it's probably not that. They've probably got some type of technology that they utilize for themselves, but also could potentially utilize for their victims. And of course, if you're running some type of medical experiment, if that's what this is, or some type of psychological experiment, who knows what they're doing? If human beings were doing this, you would want to protect the subjects through whatever means possible. And so it makes logical sense.
There's plenty of stories of abductees being miraculously healed years after they've reported their initial experiences.
You are absolutely right. And this is where we come to a case that comes from India. And I've never heard of this case, and I thought I would mention that because this miraculous healing is something that shows up. There was one case that I didn't even go into, but I just kind of thumbed through it. It was a story of a guy who had some type of condition that was worsening. His vision had been quite bad for some time, but his vision actually got to the point where he went and saw a doctor, and the doctor's like, I'm sorry, but you're going to go blind. There's nothing we can do. It's just done. I don't know if it was glaucoma, but it was something that wasn't good. And so he'd kind of, given up the fact that he was going to go blind and to get the worry about it, except for, one night, this light appeared in his bedroom. And you could still see light, like it'd still make things out. It hadn't
declining.
Yeah, it was declining, but it hadn't gone. And there's this massive flash in his bedroom, and his family goes running in, and apparently the guy's gone. Like he's just disappeared. They don't know where he's gone, and they search the house, and they search outside, and they're worried about him. And there's a second flash, and a few minutes later, he's back in the bedroom. But when he's back in the bedroom, his vision is perfect again. Like it's come back to perfection.
Great.
And he doesn't describe what happens, but what later comes out is like, oh, yeah, well, I've had interactions with these beings all throughout my life. And every time they kind of just, if something goes wrong, they show up and they heal me. Again, like a lab rat, like they're maintaining this subject. And maybe there's some positive that comes out of this because they need the guy to be able to see. So it's beneficial to him as well. But yeah, it's very strange. But this case that comes from India is a mass healing, and it relates to a flight of a 727 Boeing aircraft. This was reported by the journalist Chester Quinn, actually, and he published this article in the 16th of April in 1985, and he claims that a pilot of an Indian jetliner was 27,000 feet above Delhi. He said many of his passengers were children that had been seriously injured in a industrial accident that had happened in northern India, and they were being taken into a medical center in Bombay.
Wow.
But it's horrible.
It's a weird flight.
It's a weird flight, exactly. But the pilot claims that as he was flying, suddenly a blinding white light ripped through the plane, which caused the plane to suddenly rise as if it was in a vacuum. The pilot couldn't react, he said, and he saw the altimeter start spinning out of control before it hesitated at 53,000 feet. It then stopped at 50,000 feet and then dropped back down to zero. And he said the 727 came to a complete halt in midair. Passengers and flight attendants were screaming and grabbing for oxygen masks and seat belts. But then the pilot reported that the plane suddenly was bathed in a brilliant blue light, which changed to green, red, and then yellow before going back to blue. He looked through his windshield and he said he could see a human face, a human-like face, that was hovering just a few feet away from the plane. No body, just the face. He said he looked at his watch and it was 3:15 p.m. when the plane suddenly plummeted straight down, settling back at its 27,000 feet. So still up pretty high at standing, cruising altitude. But he said ground control was on the radio. He asked, what had gone on. They didn't know what was going on. But what was strange is they say, we've been looking for you. It's 7:15 p.m. They'd been missing for hours. Now, he landed the plane.
No radar contact?
No radar contact, nothing. But the thing is that when he went and checked on the passengers, he put it on autopilot, the plane was flying fine. He said it was nothing short of a miracle. He said when the children had boarded the aircraft, they were a pitiful sight that he could barely stand to look at. He said now he couldn't see a single scar, laceration, burn, or broken limb. Now, according to the attending physicians, they were completely speechless, and the medical officials confirmed that the youngsters showed zero signs of injury or trauma after the flight. This was some type of weird mass healing caused by some type of, it seems like it's a UFO. We never actually see a craft, but it fits in with the genre of what we hear of these reports.
I feel like we should have more evidence for this case.
I do too. I absolutely do too.
Rather than just Moira's story.
Well, Moira, as I said, it comes from...
I feel like this would be in the news.
You would think so, wouldn't
What's the guy's name again?
Chester Quinn.
Chester Quinn.
He's a journalist, apparently. It was published on the 16th of April in 1985 from New Delhi. It doesn't say which newspaper it was published in. But, this is odd. I mean, you're right. That's more of a mass kind of case. So
when I Google it, I get a Pocahontas YouTube video.
Oh, so it's legit then. That's great.
And then a link to our website. So, top sources.
Okay, well, let's go for something a little bit more logical. Let's go to the experiences of none other than Jimi Hendrix.
Okay.
Apparently, Jimi Hendrix had interactions with possibly extraterrestrials. And this relates to a story that was published by Curtis Knight. So Curtis Knight wrote the biography for Jimi Hendrix. And he referred to Jimi Hendrix as Star Child. And he claimed that Hendrix had contact with the Star Brothers, telepathic contact on multiple occasions. But Curtis recalls one time where they'd saved him. He says it was this cold winter's night in 1965, and Hendrix and the rest of the band were trying to get back to Manhattan. Now, they're over 100 miles away, and they were trying to negotiate one of the worst blizzards that they could ever recall. Apparently, it was really horrible. The winds were whipping up snow around the van. They missed their turnoff that was leading to the state highway. It put them in a direction that was completely opposite to where they wanted to go. And the next thing they realized is that they'd driven into a snowdrift that had come across the road. It was coming up over the hood of their vehicle, and it got so cold that the windows and the locks of the door actually froze up. Now, the heater was on full blast, but they had this problem where they were like, well, they've got to make a decision. Either stay inside the vehicle with the van's heater on and risk dying of carbon monoxide poisoning, or turn it off and freeze to death. Now, suddenly, according to Curtis, on the road in front of them, a bright phosphorescent cone-shaped capsule appeared. It landed on the snow. It was about 100 feet away, and it remained there silently for a few minutes. Now, apparently Jimi Hendrix is just like, okay. I mean, he may have been stoned, but he was just sitting there not really concerned about what was happening. But this thing started moving slower and slower towards their car. It seemed to have the tripod landing gear underneath it and had like this weird prop kind of thing that was happening. Now, at first, they said they were confused, but they said they couldn't believe their eyes because this thing was melting all the snow around them. It got closer and closer and closer. The door opened as it got closer of this craft, and this entity emerged. It was 8 feet tall. It had yellowish skin and slits instead of eyes. Its forehead came to a point, and the head ran straight down into the chest, giving the impression that it had no neck. It floated to the ground and glided towards the van even further and its trapped occupants. Now, they said that as this thing got closer, they could see that it generated this tremendous amount of heat or energy, and everything around them that was frozen and snow melted. It completely melted and dried up, leaving them with a dry van. Now, apparently this being came up to the window where Hendrix was sitting, communicated telepathically with him, and apparently Hendrix was like, yeah, thanks so much for that.
Is this story from Hendrix himself, or is it a story that someone's saying that Hendrix told them?
It's from Curtis Knight, who was the biographer for Jimi Hendrix.
Right.
So he's claiming that this is what happened.
If it's from the biographer.
Yeah. It's pretty weird.
Why would he make it up?
Yeah, I know. I mean, that's the thing. You wouldn't go to, I mean, unless you're really trying to get attention. But apparently the van immediately started to warm up. You know, everyone felt like they were roasting. The heat and caused everything to evaporate. They gunned the motor and got the hell out of there. Now, they simply looked in the rear vision mirror, apparently, and they saw that the snow was back and the object had lifted off like a rocket from a launch pad. Pretty amazing stuff. But you know what, though? If Jimi Hendrix was in telecommunication, was in telepathic communication with these beings, why did he die so young? Unless maybe they were calling him back.
He died so young because he took a shitload of drugs.
Well, that's the thing,
It's not a mystery.
But if they save him from being freezing to death, why wouldn't they save him from a drug overdose?
I don't know. Maybe he needed a rocket launcher to the face instead. then they would have stepped in.
You know what? So, I mean, obviously, we simply don't know because we don't know what this technology is. And it's good that people like, Jacques Vallée, for example, are trying to get, samples of implants and metal objects and that kind of stuff. But we don't know what these things are. But Moira suggests that the implants that we do find inside people's bodies are actually red herrings. They actually have been left there. They are extraterrestrial, but they're done on purpose by the extraterrestrials for us to focus on that and not focus on whatever else is going on. And she says the reason why we suggest that is because as recently as 2006, there were New Zealand scientists, there was one by the name of Graham Brown, who claimed to have invented a computer chip that was made of DNA molecules. It could be swallowed in tablet form and disappear inside the human body, and it could track genetic defects. Like an incredible technology that could be utilized. She says that there was...
This sounds like a concept rather than an actual technology.
Yeah, I'm sure it's a concept, exactly. I mean, it's claimed that, it's using the building blocks of RNA that behave like tiny transistors, and then you could, utilize it. But the reason why it's really, intriguing is because it's undetectable.
Right.
But if this is something that's even a concept that might be achievable by scientists, imagine what a species that can travel across the cosmos would be able to do. If they're capable of doing that, if we're capable of even doing that, why would they actually put an implant in that would be able to find with our conventional and very rudimentary, by their standards, technology? Why would we put something in that could be found by X-rays? And this is something that's addressed by Timothy Good. Timothy Good, in his book, Earth, an Alien Enterprise, points out that he gets information, it doesn't say where from, about an implant known as Ania. Ania is actually used to convey telepathic abilities to human beings. So when an abductee is given this implant, the implant will allow them to take on psychic abilities, which is some of the stories that I've been describing throughout this book, or throughout this segment. Now, apparently the Ania is jet black. It's a polyhedron shape, but once installed or inserted, usually behind the ear, it dissolves into thousands of very small biological robots which disperse into the body. Nanobots. I mean, as crazy as that sounds, we know that nanobots are possible, theoretically. So he says, unlike more traditional implants, it's almost impossible to detect with conventional X-ray and other scanning technologies. Now, for me, that makes more sense. I mean, if ETs are coming here and they're tagging their abductees, they're not going to leave a little piece of metal inside them that can be seen by an X-ray. They're going to do something which will disappear. and won't be detected by our conventional technology.
Well, it seems to me like they don't care what they leave behind because they leave scars, they leave imprints, there's all sorts of dots and...
Exactly. And I'm really pleased that you actually mentioned that because, yeah, when it comes to abductees with implants, it seems like there is something that's very subversive about it. It's very clandestine. But you're right. There's other cases where ETs just show up and just drop something off and don't care whatever happens with it. And that's exactly what happened to a woman by the name of Joan George. In March of 1973, she had this experience. It was published in the MUFON Journal back in August of 2001, I believe. But apparently she fell off a ladder while she was pruning a tree. And when not only did she injure herself from falling off the ladder then fell on top of her, breaking a leg. I mean, it's just really bad luck to happen. But she was trapped underneath. And when she regained consciousness, she actually feared that she might bleed to death. Her husband was away. The neighbors couldn't hear her screaming. But she says, as she was in this heightened state, this emergency, she says suddenly two strange beings came floating over the orchard. They lifted the ladder off and they pulled her up to her feet. Now, her injuries were miraculously healed within 4 days, leaving only a very small scar as evidence. Now, she was asked what these beings look like, and she says, well, I invited them in. So what happened was apparently they were 4 feet tall, they had slim bodies, long arms, they had brown-grey complexions, but their skin felt like sandpaper, and they had extremely long arms and fingers. She said their fingers were also very cold. They were wearing these one-piece, tight-fitting kind of blue-grey shimmering suits. She said it looked like rolls of plastic that had numerous bicycle inner tubes around it. But she said when she invited them in...
She invited them in?
She invited them in for a meal. They said, yes, we'd love to come in. But when they came in, she offered them food, and they were in these unusual voices inside her head said, oh, no, we don't eat food. We only have juice. And she's like, oh, well, I've got various fruit juices. And they're like, not that kind of juice. She's like, oh.
What kind of juice?
Well, that's up to the imagination there. But apparently the entities advised Joan that they won't see her again because they don't travel these trade routes very often. But before they left, coming back to why I wanted to mention this story, they gave her a small round medallion with symbols upon it. Whatever happened.
Trade routes? What is going on?
I know. It's very Star Trek, isn't it? So something very, very unusual about this. And the fact that they came inside and were like, no, we only drink juice. But not that kind of juice. It's very odd. But you know what? I mean,
so what did she do with the medallion?
We don't know. We don't know. And this is the thing. Like,
and of course, Aaron's going to put a picture of the medallion in the show notes so that we know this story is 100% real.
Again, so I'm not going to do that because I don't have a picture of it.
Because you forgot to put the Knights of Malta pin photo in the last show notes.
Did I?
I think so.
Oh, I thought I put that in. I was pretty sure I did. But okay, so let's look at more of the psychic elements though, and this strange element of, look, why do they even bother with implants when there's so many cases of out-of-body abductions? And I know in that healing case that I described just before that his body actually physically disappeared, but there are other reported cases where people are still lying in their beds, but they undergo sometimes horrific abduction experiences, but they're not in their physical form. They're in their astral form.
Their physical body is still left behind.
Exactly. But what's really strange about those cases in many of them is some people go, well, look, obviously, that just simply proves that these people are having hallucinations, dreams, hypnagogic experiences. But when these people come back from their abduction experiences, a lot of cases have two elements. One is that they have knowledge that they shouldn't have. They will be able, and they will appear in locations where they shouldn't appear. Like take, for example, there was a case of Miranda from Perth. Miranda, this happened in 2009 in Australia. She'd had a life of, strange experiences. But on one particular night, she was on a flight, and while she was on this flight, she fell asleep. Now, she had this dream that she was back at home walking around in her room. There was a craft that had appeared. But as she's walking around, she kind of snaps out of it and wakes up on the plane again. But her mother and her sister call, and they're like, I thought you were going to Perth. She's like, no, I am in Perth. I'm like, well, no, you were in your bedroom last night. So she'd somehow manifested in this, non-physical form, but actually appeared to be physical, even though she was on a plane on the opposite side of the country. So there's this case that comes from Contact Down Under, which is the other book that Moira wrote a while back. And she said this relates to a story that was told to her in 1971 by an inmate at Washington State. The event happened in 1971. And he was from the Walla Walla, the Washington State Penitentiary in Walla Walla. And he claims that every night around 7:30 or so, he would sit in a chair and he would do these visualization exercises, which ties in really nicely, Ben, with what you're going to come into about intentions, right? So I don't know what exactly he was trying to do, but with these visualization exercises, basically his imagination, he would picture a giant craft landing on the large concrete area between the big prison yard, the laundry, and the maximum security building. And he said after doing this for a while, and it was a while, he said he'd then go into his cell, he'd lay on his back, and he'd do another exercise. And he'd do this every single night at the same time. It became this routine for him. And he would try to visualize a conical beam of white light extending from his brow chakra and reaching endlessly into space. And on this beam of light, he would send what he thought was a telepathic message. He would say, interplanetary brothers, please communicate. He would send this intention out. Now, he said he got into this rhythmic breathing and he would do 7 breaths when he'd send it out, and then he would hold for 7 breaths waiting for a response. He said it would just be silence in his mind and he would just listen, and he would repeat this over and over. And he said he'd do it back and forth until he fell asleep. And he said this continued for about 13 days with the same routine. But he says on the 14th night, something that he's not entirely sure took place. He said, I was preoccupied. I forgot to do my nightly exercise. But he said that he was told that several tower guards that evening had seen something in the night sky. Apparently, it was a ball of fire. It was high up in the night sky. It had moved over the yard and headed towards where his cell was. It then suddenly accelerated north at a high rate of speed and disappeared quickly. So after he was told this, he thought, that's actually more than a coincidence. I've been sending out communication messages to craft. One shows up, okay. So he says, that night I continued my exercises. And quite abruptly, he said, I found myself standing inside the wall of the big yard in my astral body facing the center of the yard. He'd been plucked.
He got out
of his body, but he's still inside the prison. But he says, as he's standing in his astral body outside, he says he looks up into the night sky and there's this explosion of a brilliant flash of white light. And he says sitting in the grass about 75 feet away from him is this smooth, shining craft. He says it was about 100 feet across, it was about 25 feet high, and in the center, there seemed to be some type of strange thing that was circling. Now, he says, I walked without fear right up to it and into the hull. He says it was made of some type of metal that shined like liquid mercury. He said it was brilliant and it had these swirling colors all over like petroleum in a mud puddle. He said that's when he noticed that he was barefooted. And he said he was slightly tickled by it. He felt this tickling sensation, this stinging, like a mild electrical charge as he walked into the... You've got to remember, he's in an out-of-body state, and yet he's getting physical sensations from this. Now, he says he walks further inside the craft. He says into the wing, possibly 30 feet or so. He says a door just appears from nowhere. There were no seams to be found, and the door is about 4 or 5 feet long. And he says it has rounded corners, and he thought it was about 9 inches thick. He's like describing in great detail how this looked, because this is how like vivid it was for him. But he says he ducks down and he steps inside, and he says he notices upon entering that there's this circular room and it's blocked off by what seems to be a wall of glass with this heavy, thick, swirling grey-brown smoke behind it. But he says there's no glass, but it stops at this specific point where you would think glass would be. And he just sees all this smoke swirling around and around. But he says he knew he was being blocked on purpose, like it was stopping him from going any further. Now, he says, to my right, immediately inside the door, was this semicircular red couch that was attached to the wall. He then notices that there are 2 beings sitting on this couch, smiling at him. They don't greet him in any way, they just smile at him. He says they're grey-coloured and they've got sort of this weird material, like a thin texture burlap covering them. He says up inside the wall, the same material is there, and there seems to be objects inside the wall. Now, he says the wall, or the ceiling, is about 10 feet away from him. Not 10 feet, 10 inches away from him. But he says when he sits down and sits between these 2 beings, apparently the ceiling drops down at the same pace and fits with him. But he says the reason for this is like you can actually reach up and grab whatever you need and it responds to where you sit or stand. Now, he says he's looking around and he sees these identical twins. He says he believes they look like they're teenagers, like they're 17 years old. But he said he knew that they were easily 200 years old or older. He said their bodies were in perfect proportion to their height, but they were slender in their build and they were wearing a one-piece jumpsuit. Now, he said they had no visible hair on them at all, except for on their heads, but it was fine. It was fine like a newborn baby's, and it was transparent golden color. Now, he said their heads were just a little bit too big for their bodies, and they had these massive foreheads. Now, he said the one thing is, though, is that they were fantastically beautiful in their physical appearance. And he actually thought to himself, he thought, oh, wow, if the men are this hot, just imagine what the women are like. And apparently for the first time, these 2 beings start communicating. They start giggling like schoolgirls. And he's saying, well, I'm glad that I broke the ice. And he starts talking to them. Now, he says he doesn't exactly know what they're saying, but he seems to understand them. And they convey some type of information. The information is not described exactly, but he says it wasn't female or male. It was like this androgynous kind of noise, this childlike, angelic noise that was coming towards him. And he says after half an hour of discussion with them, the details of which are never revealed, essentially these beings are obsessed with the fact that he has hair on his body. And they want to know...
Whereabouts on his body?
Everywhere. They want to know all about the hair all over his body. They say, how does it feel to have hair all over your body? He says, I was quite defensive at first, then realized that compared to them, I must be a primate. We all laughed at that. He said, suddenly it was time for me to go. He said the ceiling stood up with him. He said he started moving outside. He didn't shake their hands. He didn't say goodbye. He just understood that it was a waste of energy for him to leave. He says he walks out the door. As he walks out the door, he feels his feet tingling once again. And he says he doesn't remember breathing air, but he could sense that there was a change in the air. Now, he says he walks along the hull. He says he looks back, the door's no longer there, and he exits the vehicle. Now, he says as he exits the vehicle, the area explodes again into this blinding light. And he opens his eyes, and he's once again back inside his physical body. He says it's a hard and fast snap back inside his body. He said he wasn't groggy at all, but he was comfortable and completely awake after this experience that he had just taken place. And he believes that through this intention practice, he actually had a non-physical abduction.
That's so cool that you finished with that story, because all week I've been kind of skimming through this book that was recommended to me by someone who follows me on Twitter. It's The Place of Enchantment, British Occultism and the Culture of the Modern by Alex Owen.
All right.
And I'm still kind of plowing through it because it's very dense and, full of historical details. But basically what Alex is doing is looking at how the Victorians, from this era in history, it was the ideas of Charles Darwin, the ideas of science were taking root. So essentially Owen's asking the question of if all these materialist ideas were starting to form the foundation of thinking in Western society, why were these modern late Victorian era and Edwardian men and women
going in the opposite direction?
Why were they completely absorbed in metaphysical quests? Why were they doing these strange occult experimentation? So in the introduction to this book, it's fascinating because Alex paints this scene. It's September 1898, and there's two respectable Victorians meeting in a private house in London. One's an unmarried woman in her late 30s, unimpeachable reputation. She's not a floozy. And the other is a married businessman, 3 years her senior. Now, they're friends, but they're not romantically linked in any way. They're not meeting for a liaison. Their intentions are really focused and serious, he says, because on this occasion and on their future meetings, they had decided to visit Saturn.
Saturn?
I'm just like, what? Recording the episode in meticulous detail, the woman who was more experienced of the two in these kind of undertakings, she noted, and this is all in great detail, like she's writing a scientific journal. She noted how her companion facilitated the journey by using a particular coloured symbol and proceeded via the performance of precise rituals and the invocation of names. Now, the names, they don't record them precisely because they kind of use abbreviations because it's a sense that it's so familiar to other people that are in their
like in the
weird cult, right?
Yeah.
And
so it's not for public sharing.
No,
really.
and again, everything's written matter-of-factly. It's like they're using acronyms for things that everyone else in their order will already know.
Yeah.
But we're basically told that these journeyers pass together through this hexagram into a ray of indigo and white. They travel ever upwards before finally perceiving the great dark world of Saturn. And what happens on Saturn, who they meet, what they learn, again, is written down in detail like a report from a school trip or something. Like they're writing down everything they saw and everything they did. So too is the simple observation that having discovered what they had come to learn, they returned to Earth, suffering only minimal side effects from their trip. And three weeks later, they're planning to try and visit Jupiter. other planets were visited, and eventually they tried to visit the sun. So the question that's posed, or the questions that are posed in this introduction, are who were these individuals? Because they use code names for themselves.
Yeah.
What the hell were they doing? And what do these accounts mean? How are we meant to decipher them? Is it some kind of symbology in them visiting Saturn? Is it some kind of code for communication of something else they were doing? Does Saturn represent an entity or something else they were doing?
Or we could be very pragmatic about it and be essentially they're traveling astrally to these locations, accessing astral realms.
And that's why I'm so glad that you mentioned that UFO case of the guy sitting there constantly visualizing this experience, because when I started to go further into Owen's book and the history of these occult orders, specifically the Golden Dawn, you start to realize that when they're talking about going to Saturn, they literally mean going to Saturn.
Yeah.
Yes, but it's astral. And the process of going through this magical process, very similar to what you just described.
Yes.
The key difference being they've been initiated and trained.
Yeah, it's almost like, even though it's astral travel, it's like it's similar to remote viewing. Yeah, and remote viewing, as much as it, I guess the general population thinks it's woo-woo, I mean, there's a lot of legitimacy about remote viewing.
Well, remote viewing, you can get a sense of the taste and the smell and the touch of what's being viewed.
So maybe this is an extension of that.
This is something a little bit more, because like your description of him feeling the craft through the
physical
his astral feet, we hear the same things from these occultists in this time period. They describe physically going there, feeling these sensations, seeing entities that exist where they're going. So
you can understand the appeal though, can't you? I mean, if they're able to do that, you can go to the sun as well. Like obviously human beings can't go to the sun, but if you go in astral form.
Owen makes clear that when they're talking about going to Saturn, it's not necessarily going to Saturn in our physical dimension. It's not the same Saturn that a probe from NASA would experience or observe, for example. It's still the same Saturn that we know, but it's some other
it's like a layer
dimension, it's some other layer of existence. And it seems to be in these other layers where intelligent entities exist.
I wonder if that influenced a book that's always stayed in my mind. I mean, this is 30 years ago now. There was a book that I was in primary school, and it was like they had book week. I don't know if that's an international thing, but here in Australia we have book week where they read certain books to you with a theme. And this particular theme was something like that. It was like space travel or something. And this teacher brought in this book. It was a librarian, like a librarian teacher, brought in this book, and I've never been able to find it. But the book, and I had no understanding of how like my life would end up being and, discussing these sorts of topics. But the book was essentially a story of a couple of astronauts, but they were psychic astronauts, and they were transported in a mission to the sun. Like they were actually sent to the sun, and they were asked, like what you're describing there, Ben, to somehow relay back information about what they were seeing as they went to the sun. And as they were in the sun and they were seeing incredible things and they were describing the corona passing through it, but all of a sudden the communication ended. And the whole point of the story is that the communication ended and they actually had physically been transported to the sun and were vaporized and were destroyed. Because what was happening is that they got this psychic in, and this psychic was placed in a room, and that they actually weren't doing anything. They didn't do any intention. The psychic was using like these ritualistic practices and intention to send these astronauts to actually act as like the transport for them. And when the military had asked them, had brought in the psychic was like, look, I need a sealed room and I need to have, complete silence, because if I wake up, they'll die. And the military was, no, you'll be fine. But the reason why she woke up is because a cockroach crawled across her face.
Okay.
And she woke up mid-flight and it vaporized them.
Where did you hear this?
This
This is
30 years ago
In school?
In school during book week, of all things. Like I was so young, I was a little fella. And I remember it.
So your librarian teacher was an occult practitioner,
that's what
basically.
I'm thinking now. Like,
she probably was.
I'm thinking, where did she get that story?
It's probably some old Golden Dawn manual.
Probably, yeah. After describing that, I thought that's pretty crazy.
Because these diaries where they recorded all this, they're in, sometimes in private collections, but many of them are in museums.
Yeah.
And a lot of their journeys are detailed. In great detail of what they saw and experienced. So as I said, I'm still kind of plowing through this book, trying to pull the stories out. But
I'd imagine it's quite complex.
It's really dense. But that just struck me because especially you're describing this guy sitting there and he has to do it over and over again
it's a practice.
Before it's effective. And Aleister Crowley had disciples who in their diaries they recorded sitting down and doing these particular visualization exercises to essentially pop out of their bodies, just like you just described. But it being such an arduous trial of experimentation before it actually worked. Like there's one rookie working with Crowley who essentially describes 3 days of just hardcore visualization before he was eventually able to pop out.
But this is the thing, though. I think if you actually are astrally traveling, let's say it's real, it would make sense that it shouldn't be something that's easy. Like you shouldn't just be able to achieve it. You should have to go through hard work to do it. I mean, obviously it's circumvented with drugs sometimes.
One thing, because the Golden Dawn had all these, it's like kind of like Freemasonry, they had all these degrees of initiation.
Right? So
there's
I wasn't aware of that.
There was different levels. And you were basically trained on what to do in the astral worlds because one of the first things that would happen is you would encounter entities. And Crowley, in the writings with Crowley and this particular follower he had, essentially we learned that Crowley didn't train him as well as the Golden Dawn initiates seemed to be trained because
did he get attacked?
Crowley understood that you needed to be able to discern between what was a real experience and what was generated by your mind. That much was clear. But in the Golden Dawn initiates, they were given all sorts of very detailed processes to pass tests in these astral realms. Like they would often come across guardian entities, and part of the initial encounter with a guardian entity in another dimension was a magical word. Like you had to, it was almost like a password. And the first encounter would be, what's the password? Obviously using different language, but you would have to be able to reproduce
a magical term. A
magical term, but sometimes it was even, the way they describe it is like you're vibrating a tone in the astral realm. So not only do you have to figure out how to get into this realm, you then have to figure out,
you have to speak the language
and learn the language and learn how to communicate because it's obviously different to being in our physical bodies. And you have to like vibrate to this Enochian, because a lot of the stuff the Golden Dawn was working with came from John Dee and his Enochian symbols and language that he discovered that was in the 1600s or something. So it's this crazy deep stuff, and I'm really intrigued as to how far back you can trace it and where the connections to John Dee actually form and how secret this society was before we started to learn about it.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that.
But, this kind of links to what I want to talk about in the Plus extension. I've been getting these great messages on Twitter from Nicole. She actually just messaged me while we started recording, and she's been recommending this Randonaut stuff, this Randonautica app. Before I go into the Plus section, I might just set it up a little bit and just read a little bit of the Wired article that appeared back in the 16th of May, where they essentially said, this is from Josh Walker, he said, if you've got a smartphone and access to the internet, you have everything you need to start your journey as a randonaut. Randonauting is using a random number generator to produce specific coordinates within a set radius of your current location. And you can travel to this location as a way of exploring the world around you. People gather these coordinates through a dedicated app, which is Randonautica. We'll link to it in the show notes. And they can basically further define what they want to encounter, with this app and when they're at the location. And of course, as I said at the start of the show, the app encourages users to set a personal intention before visiting a location in the hopes of uncovering synchronicities, coincidences, these occurrences outside usual patterns of experience. And these experiences are then documented on the community's various online forums. For example, one person set out with the intention of seeing something unexplainable and, as I said, stumbled across an empty armchair in the middle of a field. Another person asked for guidance and they ended up stumbling across, when they went to this random location, these coordinates, they found a tree with a strange round mirror at the foot of it, and it said, "It's your time," written on the mirror. It's weird. It's weird.
Kind of like make of it what you will as well.
So there's this huge movement on TikTok. This is where it's gathering momentum on the Chinese spyware app, TikTok.
Yeah, just like China is gathering information on you.
Yeah, the Randonauting, the hashtag, has 6.5 million views. This was back in May. It's more popular now. And the hashtag Randonaut challenge has 4.3 million views. So you've got millions and millions of people doing this. And what is so fascinating about it is they are practicing magic. I mean, no one kind of gets it explicitly because magic is such an obscure thing in modern society. People's understanding of it is skewed. But they're basically practicing divination. They're practicing chaos magic.
Do you know what, though? I think today in our culture, things are very different. Like previously when things like, practicing divination there's a reverence towards it. There was also a taboo about it. There was also religious connotations about it. I think a lot of that doesn't exist anymore. So is it actually dangerous that we're dabbling in this kind of stuff?
Well, that's why I mentioned the Golden Dawn, because there was a very strict training process.
Yeah.
You had
a 16-year-old that's just...
Exactly. Initiates had to be selected, and then they would be essentially schooled on what they were going to encounter when they started along this path. And it wasn't an easy path. It was very dangerous and required a lot from the practitioner. There's a fascinating interview with Joshua Lengfelder in the article here where he founded the movement. He invented the app and everything. He says there's two main parts to randonauting. There's exploring blind spots or places nearby that are outside of your conscious awareness, and experimenting with mind-machine interaction, the hypothesis that consciousness can influence the distribution of random numbers. And he's absolutely correct. I mean, if we've looked at the Global Consciousness Project in the past,
which is incredible stuff,
incredible results they've been getting from major events in human society that seem to affect the outcome of the series of random number generator machines they have placed all over the world. I saw an update. The scientist's name escapes me, but the guy's been running the GCP, the Global Consciousness Project, for years. He did an update for the Journal of Scientific Exploration, just in the recent journal, I think. And he was looking at the number generators being influenced by COVID-19.
Oh.
And it was still early to make sense of all the data they had, but essentially there was a nod that when the virus first started to spike, especially in the West, again, the random number generators were askew. It wasn't random anymore. The numbers were showing major deviations from randomness.
Well, it's had such a impact on the psyche of the globe. You can understand that, it would work.
Yeah, so the makers of the app believe that the human intentions can influence the output of what they're using, which isn't these regular random number generators. Again, they're quantum random number generators.
Is it Roger Nelson? Is that who?
Yeah, I think that's it. Yeah. That rings a bell. So some of the stories that have been coming out of this have been pretty wild. But before we go to our plus extension where we can dive into what's been going on and what these people are actually doing, even though they don't realize it, let me play you a bit of audio from this young woman on TikTok who had the intention of death when she used the app.
Uh-oh.
She held the intention of death in her mind and then followed these random quantum coordinates that was spat out of the app. Let's take a listen.
So I just went randonauting. I just went randonauting, and our intention was death. And we were on our way to the spot, and I look out my window, and there's someone laying in the gutter with their wife literally, on them, holding them. And so I parked and got out, and he got shot. And then she gave me the phone, and I had to call the cops. And Darius he wrapped his jacket around the wound. And then the cops came, and we got questioned, and I said to leave. And I just dropped Darius off.
She's not acting. She's freaking out. She saw someone shot, bleeding from a gunshot wound.
There's something wrong with our culture. Something's broken. Because, first of all, why would you focus on death? But then secondly, why would you advertise it to the world, your reaction like that? That's like such an emotional thing.
Well, to get likes and views, obviously.
Yeah, it's wrong. It's actually, it's really offensive.
Yeah, it's kind of a funny way to finish the free show, but here we are. Because...
Oh, look, we'll exploit it. Don't worry about that.
My point of setting it up is that there are people that are contemplating death using this app, and dead bodies are showing up.
Oh, wow. Well, you know, to lighten the load a little bit, I did promise you that we'll go into the daycare centre at the end of the world.
Oh, yeah.
So I will do that in the Plus extension as well. A very disturbing experience that Moira had that's along the lines of the Men in Black, that then later comes on to, you know, describing this weird daycare centre that might be extraterrestrial.
Okay, so coming up in the Plus extension, we'll delve into the Randonauts and what they've been discovering. I'll share some more examples, most of them not as horrible and dark as finding someone who's just been murdered. But there is something going on with this, and it's bizarre that it's hit the mainstream in such a massive way. Millions and millions of people are now using this app and essentially doing some kind of chaos magic practice, even though they don't call it that. Now, the ramifications of this, we're going to explore. We're going to look at how this was done in the past, as I said, with the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. And we're going to look at the real kind of bigger questions behind these strange synchronicities and coincidences that people encounter when they use this app as well. The meaning behind it and what that says about destiny and what that says about how much we control what we experience in our reality. That's all coming up in Mysterious Universe Plus. Head to mysteriousuniverse.org/plus for all the details. It's $9 a month. You get access to the big extensions on these shows, and you get an entirely exclusive season that comes out on Tuesdays. You get an entirely exclusive show that's separate to our regular season. There's a concurrently running season exclusive to Plus members. In addition to the extra shows, you're getting a higher quality version of the audio as well. We put out a higher quality version of the show for our Plus members. You get a totally ad-free experience when you're on Plus. All the features of our apps unlocked as well, and discounts off digital products in our store. Again, $9 a month. Help support your favorite show. It's all at mysteriousuniverse.org/plus. That's a wrap for this free edition of MU. Thanks for listening. If you're on Plus, stick around for the great stuff after the break. For everyone else, we'll catch you next week.
Show me how to get love. So tell me what you're thinking of. Show me how to get love.
Welcome back to your Plus extension.